There is a room described in ancient Egyptian texts that has puzzled scholars for centuries. It has no windows, no doors that open from the outside. The walls are covered floor to ceiling in figures jackal-headed, seated in rows, 42 of them, watching. At the center of the room stands a single object, a set of golden scales. On one pan sits a white feather. On the other, a human heart. The heart belongs to a man standing in the room. His chest is open. He is not screaming. He is not begging. He is reciting a list. And quote, "I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused anyone to weep." And quote. 42 statements, one for each judge. He recites them in order, without hesitation, as if he has known them his entire life. Because he has. This room is called the Hall of Two Truths. The Egyptians called it the Duat, the place of transformation. Every soul who died in Egypt passed through it. Every pharaoh who ever lived prepared for it. And the question being decided in that room, the question the scales were built to answer, was not whether this man had been powerful or wealthy or famous. The question was simpler than that. Had he kept the world in balance? This is not mythology. This is not religion. This is not superstition. This is a constitution. The oldest, most durable governing philosophy in human history. A single Egyptian word that held together an empire for 3,000 years, across 30 dynasties, through invasions and famines and civil wars and plagues. The word is ma and apos at. It means truth. It means justice. It means cosmic order, the idea that the universe has a correct shape and that human beings are responsible for maintaining it. The Egyptians depicted Ma and Apos as a goddess wearing a single ostrich feather in her hair. They placed that feather on the scales against every human heart that ever lived. And here's what nobody tells you about ancient Egypt. The pyramids are not the reason Egypt survived for 3,000 years. The gold is not the reason. The gods are not the reason. Ma and Apos, that is the reason. The scales are still. The feather waits. And the man keeps reciting. We will come back to what he is saying and why it matters more than anything else Egypt ever built. To understand what Ma and Apos it actually was, not as a symbol, not as a decorative concept carved on a temple walls, but as a living operational system, you have to go back to the very beginning. Not the middle of Egyptian history, not the Pyramid Age, the beginning. Around 5,100 years ago, on the edge of the Nile Delta, a man made a decision that had never been made before. His name was Narmer. He was broad-shouldered and built like someone who had won more than one war. The kind of lean that comes not from hunger, but from campaigning, from decades on the move. He wore 2 crowns, the tall white cone of Upper Egypt set inside the flat red basket of Lower Egypt, stacked one on top of the other. The double crown. Nobody had worn it before. Nobody had ever needed to, because Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt had never been one thing before. Narmer made them one thing. We know this because of a flat piece of gray-green limestone the size of a dinner plate, discovered in 1898 and now held in the Cairo Museum. It is called the Narmer Palette. On one side, Narmer stands with his mace raised above a kneeling enemy. On the other, he walks in procession, the double crown on his head, 2 rows of decapitated enemies arranged neatly below him, their severed heads placed between their feet. This is not a war trophy. This is a political document. What the Narmer Palette is announcing, to every person who saw it, in the visual language of 5,000 years ago, is that chaos has been defeated, that a man has brought 2 halves of the world into alignment, that Ma and Apos, that has been established here on this land under this king. Think about what that means for a moment. From the very first day of the Egyptian state, before the pyramids, before the gods had been fully organized, before writing had developed into the thing we recognize, the central claim of Egyptian kingship was not in quote, "I am the strongest," end quote. It was not in quote, "I conquered you," end quote. It was, end quote, "I am the proof that the world is in order," end quote. That is a completely different kind of power. And Egypt would build everything on top of it for the next 3,000 years. Now, let's talk about the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around the year 2560 BCE under a pharaoh named Khufu. You may know him by his Greek name, Cheops. Here is what is almost impossible to hold in your mind about Khufu. The only confirmed image we have of him is a 3-inch ivory statuette. 3 inches, you could close your hand around it completely. The man who built the largest stone structure in human history left behind a figurine you could lose in a coat pocket. But the pyramid he left behind contains 2.3 million stone blocks. The average block weighs 2.5 tons. The heaviest blocks, the granite ceiling beams in the King and Apos' chamber, weigh 80 tons each. They were quarried at Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south, floated down the Nile on wooden barges, and lifted into position with ropes, wooden sledges, and ramps of compacted mud brick. Let that sit for a moment. No estilo, no concrete, no crans, no machines of any kind that we would recognize. And yet the base of the Great Pyramid is level to within 2.1 centimeters across all 4 sides, an area the size of 9 city blocks. Modern engineers, given modern equipment, have tried to replicate that precision. Most of them quietly stop comparing. But here is the part that changes everything. And this is the part nobody talks about. The workforce that built the pyramid was not enslaved. We know this because in 1990, a construction worker accidentally broke through a wall near the Giza Plateau and found the tombs of the pyramid builders. They were buried with care, with food offerings and tools, with the marks of a society that considered them worth remembering, and scratched into the limestone shafts of the pyramid itself, in the graffiti of the work gangs, hidden in chambers no tourist will ever see, are names. Team names, proud ones, end quote, friends of Khufu, end quote, drunkards of Menkaure, end quote. These men were not building under a whip. They were building because Ma and Apos had demanded it, because the pharaoh and Apos' job was to maintain cosmic order, and their job was to help him do it. The pyramid was not a monument to one man and Apos' ego. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration in 2.3 million blocks of limestone that Egypt was in alignment with the universe itself. This is what the historian Jan Assmann spent his career arguing, that Ma and Apos was not merely a theological idea, but a social operating system, a code that every Egyptian institution ran on, from the courts of law to the labor gangs on the Giza Plateau to the Hall of Two Truths in the Duat. The Maxims of Ptahhotep, written around 2400 BCE and considered the oldest philosophical text in the world, opens with a man reflecting on old age and the weight of the years, and then immediately pivots to the same question: how does a person live in alignment with Ma and Apos? How do you conduct yourself so that when the scales appear, the feather does not sink? This is not abstract philosophy. This is a practical manual. And its opposite had a name too. The Egyptians called it Isfit. Chaos, lies, injustice. The crocodile that waits in the reeds. Every pharaoh who ever sat on the throne of Egypt was defined by a single binary: Ma and Apos, or Isfit, order or chaos. You were either maintaining the world or you were unraveling it. There was no middle ground. There was no, end quote, mostly aligned, end quote. You either kept the scales level or you did not. For 25 dynasties, across roughly 2,000 years of the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, Egypt kept the scales level. No civilization in human history has ever come close to that record. And then one man decided he knew better. Okay, Len Apos, let's just take a breath for a second. We in Apos, VE covered 5,000 years in about 7 minutes, and honestly, that in Apos is a lot to hold. A limestone pallet the size of a dinner plate. 2.3 million stone blocks. A workforce that called themselves, end quote, friends of Khufu, end quote, voluntarily, in the dark, where no one would ever see it for 4,000 years. If you and Apos, you made it this far, you already understand something that most people who visit Egypt never quite get. The pyramids are not the point. They were never the point. They were the receipt. The proof of purchase. Ma and Apos, That was the point. And if that idea is doing something to how you think about civilization, about how any society holds itself together, go ahead and subscribe. Because what comes next is where it gets complicated. One man, 17 years, 3,000 years of order, dismantled from the inside. We in Apos, we're not done yet. Imagine you have inherited the most powerful institution in the history of the world. Not the army, not the treasury, not the gold mines of Nubia or the grain stores of the Delta. The institution you have inherited is a belief, 3,000 years old, woven into every wall, every law, every prayer in the land, that the universe has a correct shape and that your family, your bloodline, your name has been chosen to maintain it. Now imagine you wake up one morning and decide it is all wrong. His name was Amenhotep IV. He was born into the 18th dynasty, the most powerful royal family Egypt had ever produced, the dynasty of Thutmose III, who built an empire, and Amenhotep III, who filled it with gold. He grew up in palaces that smelled of cedar and natron and warm linen. He grew up surrounded by the priests of Ammonius, the wealthiest religious institution in the ancient world, their temples at Karnak covering more ground than some cities. And something about it, all of it, struck him as false. We do not know exactly what happened. We do not have his diaries or his doubts written down in his own hand. What we have are the walls he left behind and the walls he destroyed. Sometime around 1353 BCE, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, end quote, effective spirit of the Aten, end quote, and declared that there was only one God. Not Ammonius, not Osiris, not the 42 judges of the Duat or the goddess with the feather in her hair. The sun disk, the Aten, just light, just warmth, just the thing you could look up and see with your own eyes. He closed the temples of Ammonius, sent the priests home, had the name of Ammonius chiseled off every wall in Egypt, a task so enormous that workers were still doing it years after he gave the order. He built a new capital city in the desert, on land that had never been consecrated to any god, and he named it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. We call it Amarna today. He moved the entire Egyptian court there. Every scribe, every official, every soldier in Apos, family, every cook and carpenter and physician. And if you had stood in Amarna in the summer of 1347 BCE, you would have felt something that no Egyptian had felt in 3,000 years. The absence of Ma and Apos at. Not chaos exactly, not war or famine or flood, just the absence of the thing that had always been there. The temples closed, the festivals canceled, the priests of the old gods, the ones who had maintained the scales, who had recited the liturgies that kept the world in alignment, gone. The ordinary Egyptian who woke each morning knowing that the pharaoh stood between the world and Isfet, between order and the crocodile in the reeds, now woke to a sky with nothing in it but the sun. It must have felt like losing the floor. Akhenaten had a wife. You know her face even if you don into Apos. You know her name. The painted limestone bust in the Neues Museum in Berlin, carved around 1345 BCE. Nefertiti, symmetrical features, the long neck, the flat-topped blue crown that was hers alone, unique in all of Egyptian art. And here is the detail that has haunted art historians for decades. Her left eye was never finished. The pupil was never inserted. The craftsman left it blank, and nobody knows why. Some scholars say it was intentional, that the unfinished eye was a statement, that Nefertiti was meant to look outward at the world with one eye and inward at something else with the other. She may have ruled alone after Akhenaten and Apos' death. The evidence is incomplete and contested. A figure in the records called Neferneferuiten, who held the throne briefly between Akhenaten and the boy king Tutankhamun. If it was her, she ruled in Egypt in freefall. The old god still gone. The new god not yet believed. The scales not merely tipped, but removed from the room entirely. Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE. Within a generation, his name was being erased. Not just forgotten, actively destroyed. His statues pulled down. His city abandoned. his cartouche chiseled off the same walls he had chiseled clean 17 years before. The Egyptians had a word for this kind of erasure, damnatio memoriae, a Latin term for an Egyptian practice, to unmake a person so completely that the universe itself would forget them. They nearly succeeded, but the damage was done. The pharaoh could no longer be taken entirely on faith. The contract between ruler and ruled, the promise that Mond Oppos, I was real, that the scales were honest, that the world was in order, had been broken once. And everyone knew it. A general named Hormheb took the throne around 1319 BCE and issued a royal decree ordering the restoration of Mond Oppos to every province in Egypt. He rebuilt the temples. He reinstated the priests. He filled the walls back in. He could not fill back in what Akhenaten had emptied. Mond Oppos had returned, but it returned the way a bone heals after a bad break. Stronger in some places, yes, but with a scar running through it that never fully disappears. Egypt would have great pharaohs again. Ramesses II would reign for 66 years and carve his face into a sandstone cliff so large that the sunrise, twice a year, would travel down the axis of his temple and illuminate his statue from inside. He would fight the Hittites to a stalemate at Kadesh and cover every wall in Egypt with paintings of his great victory. He would outlive 13 of his own sons. But even Ramesses knew, the way you know something in the part of your mind that never sleeps, that the scales have been tipped once, and that everything built on top of them was just a little less certain than it had been before. Alexandria, 30 BCE, late summer. The harbor still, the lighthouse of Pharos casting its light across water that has not moved in days. Somewhere in the city, a woman is sitting in a sealed room, and she is making a calculation. Her name is Cleopatra VII. She is 39 years old. She speaks 9 languages, Egyptian among them, the first ruler of her dynasty to bother learning it. She has ruled Egypt for 21 years. She has held the throne against a brother who tried to kill her, a civil war, a Roman general who became her ally, and another Roman general who became her partner, and then her ruin. She wears the vulture crown of Isis, the uraeus cobra at her brow, full Egyptian regalia, on a woman of Macedonian Greek blood, 3 generations removed from Greece itself. She chose this, every detail of it deliberate, because Cleopatra understood something that most of her dynasty never grasped. To rule Egypt, you had to be Egypt. You had to wear Mond Oppos, I like a second skin. Outside the city, Octavian and Oppos, legions are moving. Rome, patient, methodical, inevitable. Mark Antony is already dead. The fleet is gone. The treasury is sealed inside this same building, and Cleopatra has told Octavian she will burn it before she surrenders it. She will not walk in a Roman triumph. She has decided this. Here is the thing about the negative confession, the list the dead man was reciting in the Hall of Two Truths at the beginning of this story. Scholars spent decades debating what it meant. Why 42 oaths? Why recite them from memory? Why stand there, chest open, heart on the scales, and list the things you did not do? Because the scales were never about punishment. They were about proof. The dead man was not asking for mercy. He was demonstrating that he had maintained Ma and Oppos, that in his life, however small, however ordinary, he had kept the world in balance. The 42 oaths were not a confession. They were a record, a life and Oppos' work, read aloud in a room with no windows to judges who already knew the answer. Every pharaoh who ever lived made that same demonstration, not in death, but in every law passed, every temple built, every war fought and ended. The pyramid was an oath in stone. Abu Simbel was an oath carved into a cliff. The Narmer palette was an oath pressed into gray-green limestone and left for the world to find 5,000 years later. Cleopatra knew this. The mausoleum, stone walls, the door sealed from inside. She chooses her own death over Octavian and Oppos' triumph, over being displayed in chains through the streets of Rome as proof that Egypt had been conquered, over the world seeing the scales tip and stay tipped. This is her oath. 30 BCE, the last entry in 3,000 years of pharaonic record. The last time a ruler of Egypt stands in the tradition of Narmer, of Khufu, of Akhenaten and Apos, broken promise and Ramesses and Apos, 66-year repair. The last time someone wears the vulture crown and means it. Octavian enters Alexandria. Rome takes the grain. Rome takes the gold. Rome takes the lighthouse and the library and the delta and the Nile and all the land from the first cataract to the sea. The temples stand empty. The scales, the golden scales of Ma and Apos, planted in the hall of two truths since before the pyramids were built, since before the first pharaoh raised his mace above the first enemy on the first day of the Egyptian state, tip. Slowly, then completely, and they are still. Every civilization that has collapsed in the modern era, the Soviet Union, the Ottoman Empire, Rome itself, lost its ideological coherence before it lost its territory. The armies came second. The belief went first. Egypt held for 3,000 years because Ma and Apos, was not merely a religion. It was a social contract, a daily commitment, renewed by every pharaoh, every scribe, every laborer who scratched his team and Apos' name into a hidden shaft and went back to work. When the contract broke, not under Octavian and Apos' legions, but under Akhenaten and Apos' chisel, 3 centuries before, Egypt began the long process of forgetting what it was. Rome only finished what one man started. So what do you do with all of this? The obvious answer is, Egypt was a great civilization. It eventually fell, and that and Apos, the lesson. Civilizations rise and fall. We know this. We in Apos, heard it 100 times. It in Apos, printed on the back of every history textbook ever written. But that in Apos, that's not quite right. Watch what actually happened. Egypt did not fall because it ran out of gold or soldiers or fertile land. It fell because the story stopped being believed. Not all at once. That in Apos, that's never how it happens. It happened in a room in Amarna where one man chiseled the name of a god off a wall and replaced it with nothing anyone had agreed to. It happened in the silence that followed, in the temples that stayed empty a little longer than they should have, in the pharaoh who had to issue a decree ordering people to believe again, and who knew, somewhere in the part of the mind that never sleeps, that a belief you have to mandate is already half dead. Obvious in hindsight, Iasan and Apos. Here is what Ma and Apos, it actually was. Not a religion, not a mythology, a shared agreement, renewed daily, in every courthouse and harvest and funeral, that the world had a correct shape and that human beings were responsible for maintaining it. The pharaoh was not a king. He was a living proof of concept. And here is the thing that should stay with you. You live inside a version of this right now. Every society that holds together does so because enough people agree daily, without being forced, that certain things are true. That fairness is real, that the scales exist, that what you do with your one life is being, in some sense, measured. Egypt believed those scales were golden and literal and waiting in a room below the world. They held for 3,000 years. What does that tell you about the power of a shared truth? And what happens the moment you stop maintaining it? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to read them. And if this changed how you think about what civilization actually is, not the monuments, not the armies, not the gold, but the invisible agreement underneath all of it, then you already understand what Egypt spent 3,000 years trying to say. The scales exist, whether you believe in them or not.